G'day folks, I'm Keith Brown. Started on the railway in Goulburn in 1954 and my first name was actually Russell, which wasn't used, but the railway department made me use Russell, so I signed it RK Brown, and from there on I was called Arky or RK, whichever they like, and that was it. I had that all the time. I was a cleaner for about 6-8 months. Then I became an acting fireman, then went from an acting fireman to a fireman, and after about 8 years I was actually an acting driver, which I stayed as an acting driver for approximately another 4 or 5 years, and then advanced to become a driver. And in that time I fired all the types of locomotives that was in Goulburn, and right up from the P classes, the 32 classes, the standard goods engines, which consisted of 50, 53 and 55. There was 580 of those, I believe, and the P classes consisted of 32, 33s, which there was 190. We also had in Goulburn the big engines, the 57, 58 class, which I became a fireman on. And we did our firing job, and then when you got to a certain stage in your time, well, you had to go and sit for the book to pass for an acting driver, which I passed. And then first thing they did to you was put you in the shed. You come in doing shed duties. Shed duties was the hostler's job to start with, and that was a real good job, made a fortune. You used to start work at 6 o'clock and knock off at 9:30 and have 11 hours in duty and go home. It was a rip-off. It wasn't a rip-off at all, it was a good job. And then you graduated from there to an acting fireman, acting driver, acting pilotman, or the pilotman, acting fireman in the shed. And you did the shed duties, prepared engines, took them down to the train, relieved crews, and the pilotman, and his job, if you were his pilotman, you had to bring a box with you. And that, if somebody failed for duty, you went to work, and you'd go as the driver, and you stayed in the barracks until you got home, which that's why you packed the box. But the fireman, acting fireman, or the fireman, shed fireman, didn't have any of those. He didn't have to worry, but his time come round about every fortnight. And that consisted of the work in the barracks. There was all in the barracks, in the loco depot. And there was also another shift called the shed shutter, and his job, you did that once a week for a week, a full week on the job. You did these pilotman, fireman, shed fireman, and head shed shutter. You did those for a week. It might have been a fortnight. Memory's gone past. And the shed shutter was responsible for shutting any trucks out here in the loco and putting the coal trucks up on the coal stage. That could be a hairy job, that one, because you had to get into it and travel pretty hard up the steep hill, and a fair few of them went on through the other end. Don't know whether the trucks went through the other end. And that just about takes me my duties of to become where I was in the shed. And the shed fireman, pilotman, the driver prepared the engines, and so did the fireman. He had his side to do, the driver had his side. After signing on duty, you went to the oil store and collected your kit, which you took up to the locomotive and prepared your engine for the job in hand. Here we are at the oil store, and you got a kit for the locomotive, which consisted of 2 oil pots, long snouts to do your oiling, held about a pound of oil. I'm going in the old stage, don't know what metric is. Then you had a flare lamp, which had a screw top on it. And a wick went down into here, and you filled it up with kerosene for when you was working at night time. You lit the wick and it'd give you light. You had a kerosene bottle. It held a pint of kerosene with a cork at the top of it. You had a pair of monkeys, a monkey shifting spanner, a shifting spanner. Then you had waste. You got about 2 pounds of this waste. Here it is here. For cleaning the hands and wiping hands down. You had a series of wicks. You had a wick type, a bundle of them, let's put it that way, a bundle of wicks, that each wick had a metal wire to it, and the wick went into it, and you poked the wick down into the axle boxes. You pulled one out and threw it away if it was no good, and you left the rest lying there, and the oil was soaked up and run down the axle boxes via that wick. That was in the ditty box. There was a few other things, my memory won't carry me that far. You had a round oil can that held 9 pounds of cylinder oil, special oil to oil your cylinder and your valves. It would blend with the steam and stay there. Then you had a square oil can, and it held 18 pounds of oil. That was to lubricate your rods in motion and your axle boxes. You picked it up, it'd have the 18 pound in. When they'd come off the engine, the oil store man would weigh it and record down how much oil was used by that engine on its trip. There's the can that held your detonators, which we haven't got any. It had a dozen detonators that sat in the ditty box. The name ditty box was lost in lost in time. You had a baluster brush for brushing your floor and a coal pick, theoretically to break up your coal, but we threw any lumps in. It didn't matter how big they were. They just went in the firebox, but you broke them up, they'd fire better, I dare say. Your shovel, most important thing on a steam locomotive, of course, specially designed to carry a reasonable amount of coal and to go through the narrow opening of your firebox, because the wider the opening in a firebox, the more heat was lost and cold air entered it and stopped your steaming capacity. They also issued you with a sweat rag. You was entitled to 2 of these every 2 months or something like that, but in theory you could go into the store and they'd give him to whoever you wanted them. And you use those to wash the side of your engine down, your seat, anything you were going to handle, keep it clean. You supplied your own soap. In the days of kerosene, you had a hand lamp. Locos were bigger than this. This was the one issued to SMs, a small one. We had a lot bigger. Now, they had no glass whatsoever in one section, and that was your white light. You spun it round and you had a blue glass. Yeah, I got it open. You got a blue glass. I don't know whether you can see that blue glass, David. And you had a red glass. The red give you a red light, the blue give you a green light. Now that was because you was using kerosene. If it had been a battery, it would have been a green shade. Then that was for white, just light, white light, no shade at all. Your steam engines weren't for comfort of the crew. You had a wooden seat to sit on, and that was it. Most of us carried a bit of Dunlop Pillio in a sugar bag. But the 38 class, the 58 class and the Garretts had Dunlop Pillio seats fitted to them, and that's it there. Fairly heavy, and you had to take that off. When you come to loco, it was taken off your engine and put in the shed with the rest of your kit. And you had to carry all this up to the loco, including your tucker box. When going away on a job, you had to have some means of carrying your food, your towel, etc. when you went to the barracks and booked off. Now, you had a tucker box. There is a small one, made of wood, that one, and it would just be for a local job. He's got some books and that in there, knife and fork, plate, really heavy. Then we graduated up to Gladstone bags, and we carried the Gladstone bag with us. And it held our gear to go to the barracks and book off, which could be anything up to 18 hours. You could be away from home up to 40 hours, and you had to carry all your tucker with you. The fireman's job was to prepare the neath the engine, which was to oil the oil caps and so forth that'd be in there. There must be something in there, can't see it, but there'd have to be. Looks like there were grease nipples on this one. And he would oil the eccentrics up there, putting oil in. Now the driver's job was to oil these sections along here. This is a slide bar running there through here, which he would have to lubricate. There's the slide bar, I'm sorry, that's the slide bar. He'd put the oil in there and that would lubricate this bar. That bar was operating on the piston. Then on the piston, you had another rod that come back here, connected up to the main crank. Now, wherever you see an oil hole there, that's the motions, that's a wall-shaped valve gear. He would oil it. Here, oil these, right on the front there. And he would go along and oil all the motions on this side. Now into the cab, do your cab duties, and it's pretty steep. When I was a young bloke I could fly up here, but old now. The fireman's job when he got in the cab was to fill this lubricator up with special oil from the round tin. Then that was it, that was his job. He also filled the top of the air side of the air compressor. Naturally, he checked his fire and did all his work on his fire that was necessary, and virtually that curtailed his job as a fireman. Now, a driver, he would set these lubricators, open the steam valve, then set these, each one of them, to 1 drop of oil per minute. And I think it was 1.5 drops per minute to the compressor. Now that they lubricated your valves and your pistons. It was a special oil designed to blend with the steam and not dissolve in it, to give you lubrication for your working gear and that side of it. And that's about all that's left in here. Regulator there. This is your screw here, which was your reverser, and set your valves. To start the engine, you would have it closed, and you would wind the valve gear, the screw, whichever way you wanted the engine to move. Then you would open your regulator a bit until it got going. And when you went onto a train, of course, there was a different thing. You had a load behind it. So you opened the regulator further. And as you got going, proceeded to move along a bit, you would wind your valve gear back and keep going back until you had the right speed of the engine going through out of the yard or wherever you're going, light running. And the driver would adjust his regulator to do the light work, but when he got into the heavy going, the banks, as they were called on the railway, a bank, and in Goulburn they were all 1 in 40s, he would open the regulator wide at the bottom of the hill just prior to getting to it, have the reversing gear wound back to just before the centre, so the steam entering that would be live steam, but it would be only entering it for a short period. An expansion of steam would drive the piston. Now when you got into the hill of the bank, he would, and to start to slow down, he'd wind his valve gear out, putting it forward, and this moved the valves forward, opening more of the opening from the valve, steam chest to the piston, or the cylinder I should say, and this put in more steam. the regulator stayed wide open. Well, it did when I was driving them. And you settled down, you worked it from what the sound of the locomotive was making. That was just about correct to run the engine at that, and that should run you to the timetable. Now you come to, we had 1 in 40s in Goulburn heading south. All 1 in 40s, but all 1 in 40s weren't. They might have a 1 in 50 on them. Well, a lot of drivers would reduce their regulator back to reduce the amount of steam entering the cylinders. I never did that. I kept them fully open, and I wound my screw back to reduce the valve opening and less steam into them. This kept a better action on your fire and made it easier for the fireman and easier for yourself. Well, the driver had 2 gauges. He had a vacuum gauge here, and he had a steam gauge. The steam gauge on this probably went to 160 pound, and the vacuum gauge, when you was drifting down a hill, it was in red on one side and it was in steam black the other side. And the ideal situation was to adjust your regulator so your gauge was on 0. Because if you had a vacuum, it would draw the cinders back out of the smoke box and take them through the valve gear and cylinders and pistons and wear your rings out and wear your valve gear out. So, and if you had it on the steam side, you drew the wolf of the fireman because he was using his precious steam and water, and he's like to hit you with a hammer or the shovel. And you had a water gauge here which told you the amount of water that was in your boiler. Now the ideal situation was to keep it an inch, inch and a half from the top, because that couldn't be done all the time. And to check that, when the fireman first got up, he would open it by pulling that lever down, which won't move. Steam and water would come out of there, and he'd drop away and empty that, and there'd just be steam going. And then he'd shut it, and you watch where the water come to. It had to come back to where it was. This meant if it did, this and this wasn't blocked. This wasn't blocked up. You was getting proper reading to your water gauge, which was the most important thing on a steam locomotive. Everything was redundant as far as the engineman was concerned, because water in the boiler was crucial. The locomotive consisted of several different parts. The main part, of course, was the boiler and the firebox. And you also had pistons, etc., to drive them, and side motions to drive the wheels. And you also had a tender. Now that